The airport was bustling, a whirlwind of travelers clutching tickets and suitcases, rushing to catch flights that would take them to their next destination. Amid the chaos, James Carter stood calmly by the departure gate, his military duffel bag slung over one shoulder. A proud veteran who had served his country with distinction, James was no stranger to stressful environments. But today wasn't about combat or conflict. It was supposed to be a simple flight home to see his family. James, a tall, composed man with a quiet dignity, was the kind of person who naturally drew respect. His uniform wasn't on display, but his bearing made it clear that he was someone who had dedicated his life to service. Despite his calm demeanor, there was an unmistakable spark in his eyes, a quiet strength that hinted at a story untold. As he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, James noticed a woman in a crisp flight attendant uniform watching him closely. A name tag read Karen, and her expression was tight. Her lips pursed as if she already decided something about him. James brushed it off, attributing her reaction to the stress of managing passengers. After all, airports could be unforgiving places. The flight was a full one, the kind where elbows brushed and legroom was scarce. James had secured an aisle seat near the middle of the plane, a relief after hours of waiting. He settled in, nodding politely to the older woman seated beside him. Everything seemed routine until Karen appeared. Her presence was sharp, almost pointed, as she stood near James' row. Her voice, clear and clipped, broke through the hum of boarding passengers. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of something James couldn't quite place. "I need to see your boarding pass again." James obliged without hesitation, retrieving the crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. Karen examined it closely, her brow furrowing as if she was solving a puzzle. Then, with a perfunctory nod, she handed it back. "Thank you," she said, her tone neutral now, but her eyes lingered a moment too long before she turned away. The flight was just about to begin boarding announcements when Karen returned, this time flanked by another crew member. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane," she said, her voice firm. The air seemed to thicken around them, and James felt the weight of countless eyes turning in his direction. "What's the issue?" James asked, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. The murmurs of other passengers filled the cabin as everyone strained to hear the unfolding drama. Karen's expression hardened. "You've been flagged for a seating irregularity," she stated. "I'm afraid we can't allow you to stay on this flight." James blinked, taken aback. "A seating irregularity? My boarding pass was scanned without a problem. I'm in the seat assigned to me." Her lips tightened further, a thin line that betrayed her irritation. "Sir, I'm not going to argue. Please collect your belongings and exit the aircraft." The woman beside James protested, her voice trembling with indignation. "He's been nothing but polite. What's going on here?" Others began to chime in, their questions swelling into a small wave of resistance. But Karen stood her ground, her body language brooking no dissent. James sighed, his mind racing. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but this was different. This was public, personal, and deeply unjust. Gathering his things, he stood, his movements deliberate and calm. As he walked toward the front of the plane, the murmurs of the passengers followed him, a chorus of confusion and concern. Stepping off the aircraft, James found himself alone in the brightly lit jet bridge. The door closed behind him with a metallic finality. He took a deep breath, the echoes of his footsteps the only sound around him. But this wasn't the end of the journey. James wasn't a man who walked away from injustice, especially not when it was so blatant. 6 minutes later, everything changed. James stood in the sterile jet bridge, the sounds of the bustling airport muted by the thick walls. He set his duffel bag down, running a hand over his face. The confusion swirled in his mind, but it was accompanied by something more, a simmering anger that had been ignited by the humiliating ordeal. He had seen unfair treatment before, but this was personal. He didn't know exactly what Karen's issue was, but he could feel the weight of assumptions hanging in the air during their interaction. As James collected himself, he noticed a young gate agent approaching him hesitantly. She seemed nervous, her eyes darting toward the sealed plane door before settling on him. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for what happened. I don't know the details, but I don't think that was right." James gave her a small nod, appreciating her honesty, but also knowing that an apology from a junior employee wouldn't fix this. "Thank you," he said simply. "Do you know who I can speak to about this?" The agent shifted uncomfortably, glancing over her shoulder. "The supervisor is in the office down the hall, but they're pretty tied up right now." She hesitated before adding, Karen's known to be, strict about the rules. Maybe this is just a misunderstanding. James didn't answer immediately. Misunderstanding. The word lingered in his mind, but it didn't feel right. There had been no misunderstanding in the way Karen looked at him, no doubt in her tone when she singled him out. "Thanks," he said again, this time with a hint of resolve. "I'll take care of it." He picked up his bag and made his way to the supervisor's office. The walk felt longer than it was, every step echoing in the quiet corridors. His thoughts churned as he tried to make sense of what had happened. He replayed the moments on the plane, searching for a reason, a justification for the treatment he received, but nothing added up. James wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the nagging feeling in his gut told him this wasn't about a seating irregularity. The office was small and unassuming, with a glass window that allowed him to see the supervisor inside. She was on the phone, her expression a mix of exhaustion and focus. James waited patiently, his military training keeping him composed even as frustration bubbled beneath the surface. When she finally hung up, she gestured for him to enter. "What can I do for you, sir?" she asked, her tone brisk but polite. James explained the situation calmly, recounting the events without embellishment. He watched her expression shift from professional neutrality to concern. "That doesn't sound right," she admitted, pulling up his ticket information on her computer. "Your seat was confirmed, and there's no indication of any issues here." "Then why was I removed?" James asked, his voice steady but firm. "I'd like to know the real reason." The supervisor leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. "Let me investigate this further," she said. "I'll need to speak with the flight crew." James nodded, but he wasn't content to simply wait for answers. He stepped out of the office and found a quiet corner to sit. He pulled out his phone and began searching for information about the airline, its policies, and whether similar incidents had occurred in the past. What he found only deepened his frustration. There were scattered reports online of passengers feeling discriminated against or unfairly treated, but nothing concrete enough to explain what he had just experienced. As he scrolled through the search results, a notification popped up, a text message from his friend Marcus, another veteran. They had served together and often exchanged stories about their civilian lives. James hesitated for a moment before deciding to share what had happened. Within seconds, Marcus responded, his disbelief evident, even through the screen. "That's unacceptable, man," Marcus wrote. "You need to make some noise about this. Let people know." James considered his friend's advice. He wasn't the type to seek attention or make a spectacle, but this wasn't just about him. If this kind of treatment could happen to someone like him, someone who had dedicated his life to protecting others, what did it mean for those without a platform or voice? Before he could respond to Marcus, a commotion near the gate caught his attention. A small group of passengers from his flight had gathered, their voices rising as they questioned the gate agents. Among them was the older woman who had been seated beside James. She was gesturing animatedly, her words carrying across the terminal. "He didn't do anything wrong," she exclaimed, her voice filled with indignation. "I was right next to him the whole time. This is outrageous." James approached the group cautiously, not wanting to escalate the situation but also feeling a surge of gratitude for the woman's support. When she saw him, her face lit up with relief. "There you are," she said, reaching out to pat his arm. "You need to speak up about this. They can't treat people like this." Another passenger chimed in, a younger man who had been sitting a few rows ahead. "Yeah, man, we all saw it. She singled you out for no reason. It didn't seem right at all." Their words bolstered James' resolve. He wasn't alone in this. Others had noticed the injustice too. But even as he appreciated their solidarity, he knew that the path forward wouldn't be easy. Confronting an airline wasn't a simple task, and he needed to tread carefully to ensure his voice was heard without crossing any lines. Just then, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email notification from the airline, informing him that his ticket had been refunded and offering a generic apology for any inconvenience caused. The message was cold and impersonal, a stark contrast to the warmth and support he was receiving from the passengers around him. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot. James took a deep breath, his mind sharpening with determination. He wasn't going to let this slide. The airline might have thought they could sweep this under the rug, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. James Carter wasn't just a passenger. He was a man who had fought for justice on battlefields far from home, and he wasn't about to back down now. As he stood there, surrounded by allies and armed with his own unwavering resolve, James knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. James stood at the center of the growing group of passengers, each one voicing their concerns louder than the last. It wasn't just his removal from the flight that had stirred them. It was the sense of shared injustice, a feeling that something larger was at play. The older woman beside him, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Whittaker, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've got to fight this," she said firmly. "People need to know what's happening here." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "I will," he replied, "but I need to do it the right way." Nearby, Karen, the flight attendant, stood with her arms crossed, her face impassive as she exchanged a few quiet words with another crew member. She seemed unfazed by the scene unfolding in the terminal, as though this were just another inconvenience in her day. James couldn't help but wonder what had motivated her actions. Was it personal bias? A misinterpretation of a situation that didn't exist? Or something even more systemic, buried beneath the polished veneer of the airline's image? James' thoughts were interrupted when the airline supervisor reappeared, her expression carefully neutral. She approached him with a clipboard in hand and motioned for him to follow her a few steps away from the crowd. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice low but firm, "I've spoken with the crew and reviewed the situation. The removal was deemed necessary for operational reasons." James raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. "Operational reasons," he repeated. "I've heard a lot of vague explanations, but none of them make sense. What exactly does that mean?" The supervisor hesitated, a gaze flickering toward Karen for the briefest of moments. "I can't disclose specifics related to crew decisions," she said finally, "but I assure you the airline takes these matters seriously." James could see the cracks in her composed facade, the telltale signs of someone trying to navigate a delicate situation without revealing too much. "I'm not looking for assurances," he said evenly. "I'm looking for answers." Before she could respond, the murmurs from the group behind him grew louder. Passengers were filming the scene with their phones, and one man had started a live stream, narrating the events with a mix of outrage and disbelief. The sight of the cameras seemed to unnerve the supervisor, who shifted her stance uncomfortably. James knew this was his moment. He turned to face the group, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to command attention. "I appreciate all of you standing up for me," he began, addressing the passengers. "This isn't just about me being taken off the plane. It's about accountability and fairness. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration now mingled with a sense of purpose. Mrs. Whittaker stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear. "We're not going to let this slide," she declared. "We all saw what happened, and we're not leaving until we get answers." Karen, who had been watching from a distance, finally stepped forward, her expression hardening. "I did what I thought was necessary," she said, her voice loud enough to cut through the chatter. "The safety and comfort of all passengers are my priority." The words hung in the air, their ambiguity only fueling the tension. James turned to her, his gaze steady. "If that's true," he said, "then why wasn't I given a clear explanation? Why was I singled out when my boarding pass was valid, and I was sitting in my assigned seat?" Karen didn't answer immediately, a jaw tightening as she glanced toward the supervisor. The silence was damning, and James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about one flight or one decision. It was about standing up to a system that too often operated without accountability. As the scene continued to unfold, another figure stepped into the fray. A younger flight attendant, her uniform pristine and her face lined with worry, approached James cautiously. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I wasn't supposed to say anything, but I think you should know. Not everyone agreed with what happened. There were concerns raised about the decision to remove you." James' eyes narrowed, his focus sharpening. "Concerns from who?" he asked. The young woman hesitated, glancing nervously at Karen and the supervisor. "I can't say more," she said finally. "But please, don't stop fighting this. You're not alone." Her words added another layer to the mystery, a thread that hinted at internal dissent among the crew. James felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. As he considered his next move, his phone buzzed again. It was Marcus, and this time his message was more direct. "Bro, I just posted your story on social media," it read. "It's blowing up. People are asking for details. You need to go public with this." James's initial reaction was hesitation. He wasn't one to seek attention, but Marcus had a point. The more people who knew about what had happened, the harder it would be for the airline to sweep it under the rug. With a deep breath, he opened his phone's camera and started recording. "My name is James Carter," he began, his voice steady. "I'm a veteran, and earlier today, I was removed from a flight without any clear explanation. I don't know why this happened, but I do know it wasn't right. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for accountability. This isn't just about me. It's about fairness and respect for every passenger who steps onto a plane. He stopped recording and uploaded the video, unsure of what would happen next, but knowing that he had taken an important step. As he hit post, he noticed the ripple of reactions among the passengers around him. Some nodded in support, while others checked their own phones, already seeing the story begin to spread. The tension in the terminal was palpable, a mix of uncertainty and anticipation. James didn't know where this path would lead, but he was ready for the fight ahead. The airline might have tried to silence him, but they had underestimated the power of truth and the resilience of a man who had faced far greater battles before.